everybody. Today the question concerns baptism in the Holy Spirit or Spirit baptism. And I want to try to unpack that for you. As you may know, the church takes two very different kinds of positions on this. There's a whole wing of the church that sees this basically as the Spirit coming to dwell in believers, which is what makes us a Christian, as Paul says in Romans 8. But then there's another part of the church, the charismatic Pentecostal wing of the church, that sees this as a second blessing, as it were, or a baptism that is subsequent to conversion. And that's a fairly growing view of Spirit baptism. Now, if you're Pentecostal, and mostly in the white North American Pentecostal denominations, you would also insist that the sign that God has given, or initial evidence that God has given that you have been baptized in the Holy Spirit, is that you are speaking in a language you never learned, or speaking in tongues. So that's kind of the two parts of it for Pentecostalism, that it's subsequent to salvation, following salvation, so it's a second thing, and also that you will speak in tongues as the sign. So where are the biblical passages for this? Well, there are three in particular. So if you're a young Pentecostal student getting ready for your credentials interview, this is a good time to pay attention. The first is, they're all in Acts, and the first is in Acts 2, and we know it as the day of Pentecost. And basically, the disciples are waiting as Jesus commanded them for the promise of the Father. They are in the upper room, and the Holy Spirit comes in and baptizes everybody, and they begin to speak in tongues. So the question that arises in all three of these passages is this one. Were those involved Christians prior to this experience, or is this what made them Christians? So if you're on the one wing of the church, you're saying this is what's making them Christians. If you're on the other wing of the church, you're saying they were already Christians, and this is a Spirit baptism, which is given as power and boldness for witness, largely. So that's Acts 2, that's the first one. So you may ask in Acts 2 then, if they were becoming Christians, this is fairly straightforward. They're waiting, God baptizes them, the Spirit dwells in them, they become Christians. If you're Pentecostal, charismatic, you'd want to ask, when did these folks become Christians, as it were, with the Spirit dwelling within? And the answer to that is right back in John, where Jesus breathes on them and says, receive the Holy Spirit. So that would be their indwelling for salvation. Acts 2 would then be their Spirit baptism. So there's two ways of looking at that. The next passage is in Acts 10, when Peter has had a vision of the sheet being let down from heaven, and you can go read that there. And as he's relaying these words, this story, the Holy Spirit comes in and falls on his hearers, and they know this because verse 46 says, for they heard them speaking in other tongues. So Acts 10 is not so much a passage about subsequence, about it happening after they became Christians, but it is a great passage to support the idea that the sign will be speaking in tongues. Then the third passage is in Acts 19, where Paul meets a group of what the Bible calls disciples, which is a really key word, and he says, have you received the Holy Spirit since you believed? Or when you believed, or even after you believed. That word can mean three things there. And they say, no, we've not even heard there's a Holy Spirit. So he prays for them, lays hands on them, and they speak in tongues and prophesy. So what's going on there? Well, if they are already Christians, as disciples seems to indicate, then they've become Christians without properly being instructed about the Holy Spirit. So he's living in them, dwelling in them as Christians, even though they're not fully aware of it. And Paul prays for them, and then they are baptized in a second blessing or a subsequent event, and the sign is speaking in tongues and also prophecy. If you're from the other part of the church, then you would say, what's going on here is that their salvation is not really complete. They've been baptized in John's baptism only as Jews. They've not received the Spirit for salvation. And so they are prayed for, and when they do, they become Christians, and they also speak in tongues, much as folks did in Acts 2 and Acts 10. So those are the three key passages, and again, as I walked you through it, you can see that the real question is, are we Christians when we enter this experience? If so, it's a second blessing for power, or in fact, are we becoming Christians in each of those three? So for the Pentecostal charismatic wing of the church, of which I'm a part, we would say that in each of those three cases, the folks are Christians already, or Christians in the moment in Acts 10, and then the Spirit falls upon them. They speak in a language they never learned as a sign that in fact they have now been Spirit baptized and given power for boldness and witness. So that's your three passages. That's the basic breakdown. In my next video, I'll unpack some very common questions about this, like doesn't this create two classes of Christians? And what happens if I do something else? I receive another gift instead of speaking in tongues, or even are tongues necessary, or why did God choose tongues? So you can look forward to that in the coming days. As always, if you got questions, comments, cries of heresy, I'd appreciate reading about them below.